the following topics that are important. So in heredity and evolution, we have Mendel's law, the three laws that were given by Mendel and their significance. Then we have types of traits, basically inherited traits and acquired traits, and what is the difference between these two types of traits, basically. Then monohybrid and dihybrid cross. So along with their examples, along with the ratios that one would obtain, right? Phenotypic as well as the genotypic ratio, and sex determination. If we look at our environment, the following topics that are important: decomposition, how decomposition takes place and what is the importance of decomposition in an ecosystem. So let's say if decomposition was not to take place, what all would be the harmful effects that we would see, or what would be the imbalance that we would see in the ecosystem. After that, trophic level, food chain and food web, how these things are interconnected and interrelated to each other. After that, flow of energy, how energy flows from one trophic level to another, and what are basically the loss of energy that takes place when it is moving from one trophic level to another. Types of waste and waste management. What are the different types of waste and how can we dispose them of? How are different types of waste disposed of? What is their mechanism of management of those wastes? And lastly, ozone depletion. What is ozone? Firstly, why is it important? What are the causes that ozone depletion is taking place, and what are the concerns that are revolving this process of ozone depletion? Right, so these are some of the important topics that we will be needing to cover in this chapter. So let's first start off with the multiple choice question. First question says, a detritus food chain begins with. Our options are carnivores, herbivores, omnivores, and decomposers. So we know that a detritus food chain, what it will do is or a detritus food chain is basically a food chain that involves decomposition, right? So a food chain that involves decomposition is obviously going to begin with the decomposers, right? So a detritus food chain begins with D, decomposers is the correct option that we are going to mark here. Next, in food web, the flow of energy is non-directional, bidirectional, unidirectional, and none of the above. So we know that when we are talking about a food chain or any kind of flow of energy that we see, it is always a unidirectional flow of energy. It can never be reversed, right? The pyramid of energy is always upright and can never be reversed. So pyramid of energy is always upright, which means that this flow of energy just takes place in one directional, to successive trophic levels, and it cannot be reversed. So the answer that we will choose here is the flow of energy is unidirectional. So option C, unidirectional, is the correct option. Moving on to the next question. Which of the following is not an example of abiotic factor? So first we need to understand that there are two types of factors that we deal with. Biotic factor, which comprise of all the living, and abiotic factors that comprise of the non-living aspects of our ecosystem, right? So if we look at the four options, water, plants, heat, and temperature, then obviously out of these four options, the one which is not an abiotic factor is plants. Plants come under biotic factors. Rest, all of them, water, heat, and temperature, are abiotic factors, but plant is not an abiotic factor. It is a biotic factor. So the correct option here would be B. Plants is not an example of abiotic factors. Okay. Moving on to the next question. The genetic constitution of an organism is called, right? Let's have a look at the options. Starting from C, variation refers to the differences between the organisms, or the changes or the differences that makes each individual unique. So this is basically the differences that are present in an organism as a result of evolution. When we look at the word phenotype, phenotype basically represents the external morphology of an organism, how an organism appears, right? The appearance or the morphology or the external features or characteristics of an organism. So phenotype refers to external morphology or external characteristic or external features. If we talk about genotype, then yes, genotype refers to the genetic constitution of an individual, how an individual is at the very basic gene level, that will determine the genotype of the individual. So the genetic constitution of an individual is called its genotype. Hence, answer A, genotype, is the correct option. All right. Moving on to short answer type questions. First question, differentiate between biodegradable and non-biodegradable substances with the help of one example each, right? So we know that waste or substances rather can be divided into two types, biodegradable and non-biodegradable. Biodegradable substances are basically those substances that are not harmful, that are not toxic, because they eventually get broken down in due course of time. They will get broken down into simpler, harmless substances by the action of certain microorganisms. And as a result of which, biodegradable waste, they do not accumulate or they do not cause pollution. Whereas if we look, or if we have a look at the biodegradable waste, then these are substances that do not get degraded easily by the action of microorganisms. They are non-degradable, and as a result of which they keep on getting accumulating, accumulated in our environment, and they sort of contribute to the pollution, or they become toxic to our environment. So these waste, they actually contribute towards pollution. So biodegradable waste, let's have a look at the answer. Biodegradable waste are waste materials which can be broken down into harmless substances in nature in due course of time by the action of microorganisms such as bacteria. They are known as biodegradable waste. So biodegradable waste जो है वो कुछ time बाद by the action of microorganisms such as bacteria वो automatically decompose या degrade हो जाएगा. Examples: cattle dung, wool, paper, compost, etc. If we look at non-biodegradable waste, these are waste materials which cannot be broken down into harmless substances by the action of microorganisms. Such wastes are known as biodegradable waste. We can also add that because they cannot get degraded, because they are not easily degradable or they are not easily broken down, such wastes tend to get accumulated in our environment and they become toxic and can contribute towards pollution because they are not getting broken down, they are not getting degraded. So as a result of that, they are indirectly getting accumulated, right? So they contribute to pollution, whereas biodegradable waste, because they are broken down by the action of microorganisms, they do not contribute to pollution. Examples of biodegradable waste: plastics, polythene bags, metal articles, glass objects, etc. Okay, so 2 marker hai. We have given the definition as well as one example, and we can also add one more point which I just said that biodegradable waste, because they get broken down, they will not get accumulated or they will not contribute to pollution, whereas non-biodegradable waste, because they get accumulated because they are not broken down easily, so they will contribute towards pollution. So you can add this point as well. So 3 points for a 2-marker question is more than enough, right? Next, write a difference between inherited traits and acquired traits, giving one example each. So basically, acquired traits are those traits that cannot get inherited, that are not passed from parents to the next generation, that are not passed from parents to progeny. So acquired traits are not passed on from one generation to another. Why they are not passed on from one generation to another? Because these traits are not inculcated at the gene level. These traits are not caused by change in the genes. These traits are not caused by the change in the DNA, right? These traits will not be inherited. Only the traits that are present at the gene level, that are present at the genetic level, will get inherited. Other traits that an organism develops during its lifespan, during its course of life, because of or in response to its surrounding, those traits are called acquired traits. Acquired traits do not cause any change in the DNA. They do not cause any change at the genetic level, as a result of which they will not be inherited to the next generation. For example, if we take a mice and we cut its tail, the next progeny that will be born will not be tailless, because that cutting of tail was an external change. It did not bring about any change at the DNA level. It did not bring about any change at the genetic level. So that trait will not be passed on, or that trait will not be inherited. On the other hand, if we talk about inherited traits, then inherited traits are passed on from one generation to another. So these are the traits that will be passed on to generations. Why? Because these are caused by change in the genes at the very, very basic genetic level, right? So they will be inherited from the parent to the progeny. So let's have a look at the answer. A trait or a characteristic of an organism which is not inherited but develops in response to the environment is called an acquired trait. For example, if a group of mice are normally bred, all their progeny will have tails. Now, if the tails of these mice are cut by surgery in each generation, tailless mice will not be produced. This is because removal of tail is an acquired character and does not cause any change at the genetic level, does not cause any change in the genetic constitution of the organism. Whereas a trait or a characteristic of an organism which is caused by change in its genes or DNA is called an inherited traits. Inherited traits can be passed on to the progeny of the organism because they have produced changes in the genes or the DNA of the organism. For example, skin color in human beings can be referred to as an inherited trait. Okay, so we have given the difference between the two types of traits, as well as we have given an example of each. Next question is divided into two parts. So let's answer the question part-wise. Why do producers always occupy the first trophic level in a food chain? So each individual, each organism has a specific position, has a specific place in a food chain, and that is what we call the trophic level of the organism. The food chain obviously begins with the producers because they are organisms that prepare their own food. They do not depend on any other organism for food. Rather, other organisms depend on them for food, right? So they are the first source of we can say food. They serve as first source of food for all the other organisms. So that is why, because every food chain has to begin with the producers, because they are basically autotrophic organisms that can synthesize their own food. That is why producers always occupy the first trophic level in a food chain, right? So producers are green plants, or for that matter, any organism that is capable of synthesizing their own food, any organism that is basically autotrophic in nature, that can manufacture food using carbon dioxide and water in the presence of sunlight. That is, they are autotrophs. They serve as a source of food for all the non-producers or consumers, directly or indirectly. So every other organism that occupies every other trophic level, whether it is the second trophic level or the third trophic level, they are dependent on these producers for food, whether you call it a direct dependency or an indirect dependency, but all the other organisms are dependent on the producers for their food requirement. Hence, producers occupy the first trophic level in a food chain. Next part of the question, which of the following are at the second trophic level of food chain? Carnivores, autotrophs, and herbivores. So autotrophs are basically the producers, right? The organisms that are directly dependent on these producers, or that directly consume these producers, are primary consumers. Or in other words, we can say that herbivores are directly dependent on producers for food. Herbivores directly consume producers for food, right? So if we talk about the second trophic level out of these three, then herbivores will occupy the second trophic level of a food chain. So autotrophs will occupy the first trophic level, herbivores will occupy the second trophic level, and carnivores who are going to eat these herbivores, they are going to occupy the third trophic level of this food chain, right? Moving on to 3 marker questions. First question is divided into 2 parts. Explain how pesticides enter a food chain and subsequently get into our body. So we know that pesticides are basically chemicals that are sprayed on crops for crop protection. But these pesticides, because they are chemicals and they are non-biodegradable, they do not get degraded or they do not get broken down. These pesticides, they seep inside the soil. When they seep inside the soil, they can actually enter the crops or the plants that are growing in that soil through the root system. So if these pesticides get washed away with soil, they go down in the soil, then they can very well enter the crops that are growing in that soil through the root system. So when these pesticides enter the system of the plants or the crops, then they stay there, right? Now, if we, for example, if we take that plant, we wash it, all right, that can get rid of maximum pesticides that is present externally on the external surface. But still, it won't be enough to get rid of 100% of pesticides, because some of the pesticides, via the root, it has entered into the tissues of the plants, we can say. So when we consume those crops or when we eat those crops, these chemicals can enter our body and they can get accumulated in our body as well. That is why excessive use of chemical pesticides or fertilizers is avoided, because not only can they harm the plant, but they can also harm the individuals that are consuming those plants or consuming those crops. So pesticides used for crop production, when washed away, go down into the soil. These pesticides are absorbed by plants, which are the producers. On consumption of these plants, the pesticides enter our food chain, and being non-biodegradable, these chemicals get accumulated and enter our body. Right? Next part of the question, name two main components of ecosystem and also give examples of each. So as we have discussed earlier also, the two main components of an ecosystem are the biotic component, which comprises of all the living organisms, and the abiotic component, which comprises of all the non-living organisms. Example of biotic components can be plants and animals. An example of abiotic components can be water, temperature, etc. Okay. Moving on to the next question. List two reasons to show that existence of decomposers is essential in an ecosystem. State the possible consequences of elimination of decomposers from Earth. So first we have to give reasons why decomposers are essential in an ecosystem, and then we have to explain what would happen if decomposers were eliminated from Earth. So firstly, decomposers are essential because if there are no decomposers present around us, then all the detritus, all the dead bodies of plants and animals, they will just keep on getting accumulated. They will not be broken down, or they will not be degraded. They will keep accumulating, and that will result into unnecessary pollution taking place. Apart from that, if these bodies of plants and animals, they are not degraded, then the organic matter which is present, or the elements that are present in these plants and animals, they will never return to soil, or they will never return to water, right? And it is going to disrupt the nutrient cycling, or it is going to disrupt the process of this recycling of nutrients that takes place. Okay, so that is why decomposers are essential in an ecosystem. The existence of decomposers in an ecosystem is essential because if there were no decomposers, then the dead bodies of plants and animals would get accumulated, and the elements constituting plant and animal bodies would never be returned to their original pools like soil, air, or water. In such a case, the organic waste would keep on getting accumulated, and the cyclic process of life and death would be disrupted. Okay. Now, what are the consequences that we are going to face if decomposers were to be eliminated from Earth? So consequences of elimination of decomposers are, firstly, there would be no recycling of nutrients, and therefore raw materials to produce food will not be available to producers. If there is no recycling of nutrients, then there will be no nutrients present in the soil. If there are no nutrients present in the soil, it is going to affect the growth of plants, because plants require these nutrients, or plant require certain elements for their growth and development. If there are no nutrients, or if there are no elements present in the soil, then it is going to disrupt the growth of the plants, which are our producers. If the growth of producers is disrupted, then it is going to disrupt the entire food chain. It is going to affect the entire food chain. So because there will be no recycling of nutrients, therefore raw materials that are required to produce food by the producers will not be available. Producers will not be able to synthesize their food, and hence the entire food chain is going to get affected. So first consequence that we face is this. Secondly, as we already discussed, there will be no degradation, there will be no breaking down taking place, and the dead body of plants and animals will keep on accumulating in the absence of composition, and ultimately it will result into pollution taking place, right? So these are the two consequences that will take place if decomposers are eliminated. Moving on. Okay, Name the plant that Mendel used for his experiment. What type of progeny was obtained by Mendel in F1 and F2 generation when he crossed tall and short plants? What is the ratio he obtained in the F2 generation? So Mendel selected pea plant Pisum sativum for his hybridization experiments, and he started by taking the parent progeny as two pure line plants having homozygous gene capital T for tall and small t for dwarf. When he crossed these plants, the first generation that he obtained was the first filial generation, and he realized that all the plants that he obtained in that generation were tall, which means that one of the trait overpowers the other trait. One of the trait is dominant over the other trait. In this case, tallness is dominant over dwarfness, right? So such a trait or such a character that appear in the first filial generation and they sort of mask the other character, such traits are known as dominant traits. Then he selfed this plant that he found or that he got in the first filial generation, and in the second filial generation what he obtained was capital T, capital T, capital T, small t, capital T, small t, small t, small t. So first three plants are tall and last one is dwarf, which means that recessive traits do not disappear. Recessive traits, they may be masked by the dominant trait for some time, but they eventually show their presence or they eventually express themselves. Recessive traits do not disappear, right? In further generations, in the upcoming progeny, they will express themselves, right? So maybe they do not express themselves in the first filial generation. They may get masked by the dominant trait, but eventually in the subsequent generations, they may be able to express themselves, right? If we look at the ratio that we obtain in these F2 generation, then one ratio will be what we see externally, you know, what it appears to be externally, and the second ratio that we will see is depending on the genetic constitution of the plant. So phenotypically, if we see the external characteristic, the ratio of tall is to dwarf. So three of them are tall and one is dwarf. So the ratio that we obtain is 3:1. But if we look at the genetic constitution, it is different. One is homozygous tall, two of them are heterozygous tall, and one is homozygous dwarf. So if we talk about the phenotypic ratio, it comes out to be 3:1. If we talk about the genotypic ratio, it comes out to be 1:2:1. So let's have a look at how we are going to answer this question. Mendel selected garden pea Pisum sativum for his series of hybridization experiments. He first selected two pure line plants, tall plant having gene capital T, and short plant having gene small t, and then cross such plants having contrasting characteristic. Contrasting means opposite characteristics. In the F1 generation, he observed that only one of the two contrasting character appeared, and he called this character as dominant. In this case, tall is the dominant characteristic that got expressed in the first filial generation. And the one which does not get expressed in F1 was called as recessive. He later selfed the F1 plants and observed that both the traits appear in the next generation in a definite proportion. This can be explained by the following cross. So this cross is made parent generation, then the F1 generation, then selfing of the F1 generation, and finally the F2 generation, right? So the plants in F1 generation will be all tall, and in F2 generation, 3 of them would be tall, 1 of them would be dwarf. So the phenotypic ratio, if we just look at the appearance, the phenotypic ratio comes out to be 3:1. But if we look at the genetic constitution as well, then the ratio would be 1:2:1. Okay, let's have a look at long answer type question. Question says, it is a matter of chance whether a couple will have a male or a female child. Justify the statement by drawing a flow chart. So obviously it is a matter of chance. There are 50% chances that, you know, the child would be a male child, and there are 50% chances that the child would be a female child. And it is basically determined by the father, because father produces 2 types of gametes, we can say, X, Y, one having X chromosome, other having Y chromosome, whereas the mother produces only a single type of gamete having X chromosome. So it basically depends on which of the chromosome from the father's side is, or which of the gamete from the father's side is fusing with the female gamete. So how do we answer this question? Sex is determined at the time of fertilization when male and female gametes fuse. Male produces 2 types of gametes, that is having X or Y chromosome, and female produces same type of gametes containing X chromosomes. The sex of the child is determined at the time of fertilization when these male and female gametes fuse to form a zygote. If a sperm carrying X chromosome fertilizes with the female gamete carrying X chromosome, then the offspring will be a girl. This is because the offspring will have XX combination of sex chromosome. But if a male gamete or the sperm carrying Y chromosome fertilizes with the egg or the female gamete, then the offspring will be a boy, because this combination will be an XY combination. So therefore, there are 50% chance of a male child and 50% chance of a female child being born. And it is determined by the father. Why sex is determined by the father? What is the reason? The question can be framed in this way also, that comment or justify or give reason why sex of the baby is determined by the father. So sex of the baby is determined by the father because the father produces different types of gamete. The father produces different types of gamete. Right. The mother is producing the same type of gamete, so it doesn't matter, right? The mother is producing the same type of gamete. It depends on what type of gametes from the father's side is getting fused with the male gamete, whether the gamete containing X chromosome is getting fused or whether the gamete containing Y chromosome is getting fused. Mother ki side se it's the same. So it depends on the father's or the male gamete, which gamete is getting fused with the female gamete, right? So here, X from the father's side fuses with X from the mother's side, results into a girl. Y from the father's side fuses with X from the mother's side, results into a boy. So there is a 50-50% chance of whether the child that would be born would be a male or a female. Okay, moving on to next question. So this question is divided into 4 parts. Let's have a look at the question part wise. First part, construct a terrestrial food chain comprising of 4 trophic levels. So there can be multiple answers to this. There is no right or wrong answer. There can be multiple answers to this. So we have selected grass, insect, frog, and eagle. Next, what will happen if we kill all organisms in one trophic level? So if the organisms of a particular trophic level are killed, then it is going to create imbalance in the ecosystem. It is going to create imbalance in the ecosystem because each organism present at each trophic level is contributing to the food chain or is, being a part of the food chain. If you cancel out or if you remove one part, then the entire food chain or the entire food web will come crashing down, because all the organisms that are present at different trophic levels, they are interdependent on each other in some or the other way. There is an interdependency that we see between organisms that are present at different trophic level, and therefore if we choose to entirely remove all the organisms that are present at a specific trophic level, then it is going to surely result into an imbalance in the ecosystem, and it is going to disrupt the entire ecosystem altogether, right? So removal of the organisms of any trophic level will always adversely affect the ecosystem. Let's have an example. If we remove lions and tigers, which are the topmost carnivores from the ecosystem, what will happen? If we remove the lions and tigers, there will be a rapid increase in the deer population, because these lions and tigers, they eat deer, right? So if we remove these lions and tigers, there will be an increase in the deer population. Deer is going to consume all the vegetation. They are going to rapidly eat all the plants. They are going to consume the entire vegetation. And then there will be a decline in the number of plants. There will be a decline in the vegetation. Once there will be a decline in the vegetation, the deers will have nothing to eat because they depend on those plants for food, right? They depend on those plants for survival. So if the vegetation is going to decline, then the deers will eventually die of hunger, and the population of deer will also come crashing down. The population of deer will also decline. So there is an interdependency amongst these organisms, and therefore if any trophic level is, or if organisms present at any trophic level are completely removed, then it is going to adversely affect the ecosystem. So example, the removal of lions and tigers, top carnivores, will cause rapid increase in the deer population, which leads to rapid consumption of vegetation, resulting in scarcity of vegetation and population of deer, population, and the population crash of deer. Okay. Next question, let's have a look at the question. Calculate the amount of energy available to the organisms at the 4th trophic level if the energy available to the organism at the 2nd trophic level is 2000. So the energy that is present at the 2nd trophic level is 2000. We have to calculate the energy that will be present at the 4th trophic level. So we know that there is a 10% energy rule, that only 10% of the energy is passed on from the previous trophic level to the subsequent or the successive trophic level, because most of the energy is lost as heat, or it may be lost in the metabolic practices of the organism. So only 10% of the energy is passed on to the next trophic level, or is received by the next trophic level. So if we are saying that the energy present at the second trophic level is 2000 joules, it means that only 10% of this would be passed on to the third trophic level, which is 200 joules will be passed on to the third trophic level, and only 10% of 200 joules will be passed on to the fourth trophic level. So only 20 joules will be passed on to the fourth trophic level. Therefore, and we can also guess that the energy that would have been present at the first trophic level would have been 20,000 joules. Although that's not necessary for the question, we can get the answer even without calculating the energy present at first trophic level, but just for understanding purposes, we can calculate that as well. So the first trophic level has 20,000, then 2,000, 200, and 20. So if the energy that is available to us at the second trophic level is 2,000 joules, then according to the 10% law of energy, the energy that will be available at the fourth trophic level would be 20 joules. Okay, let's have a look at the last part. Why should biodegradable waste and non-biodegradable waste be discarded into separate dustbins? So we know that the mechanism of disposal of biodegradable waste and non-biodegradable waste is different. Biodegradable wastes are easily broken down by the action of microorganisms, right? So they can easily be degraded. But non-biodegradable waste, they cannot be broken down. And there are some other methods that we have to adapt for their disposal. They can be burnt off, they can be, dumped into landfills, or they can either be recycled if it is a recyclable type of waste. So basically the approach that we follow for the disposing of biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste, that approach is different. The methods of disposal of these two wastes is completely different. And because the methods of disposal is different, therefore for ease and for convenience, these two wastes should be thrown away in different dustbins. So let's have a look at the answer. Biodegradable wastes are decomposed naturally by the action of microbes, which degrade them to their simple constituents, enabling their nutrients to recycle among the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystem. However, non-biodegradable waste cannot be disposed of naturally since they cannot be decomposed by microbes. Such wastes are either recycled, incinerated, or put in landfills. As the disposal method of two types of waste is different, it is advisable to discard the two types of waste in two separate dustbins. All right. Okay, moving on to the assertion and reason type of question. So again, two statements will be given, and depending on which suits the best, we have to choose one of the four options. So option A stands for both assertion and reason are true, and reason is the correct explanation of assertion. Option B stands for both assertion and reason are true, but reason is not the correct explanation of assertion. Option C says assertion is true, but reason is false. And option D says assertion is false and reason is true. So let's have a look at the first set of statements. Assertion says polythene bags and plastic containers are non-biodegradable substances. This statement is absolutely correct. Polythene bags and plastic containers they come under non-degradable substances. Reason says they can be broken down by microorganisms into natural, simple, harmless substances. So this is absolutely incorrect. We know that non-biodegradable substances, they cannot be broken down by microorganisms into simple substances. Therefore, assertion is true, but the reason given is false. So we are going to choose option C. Assertion is true, but reason is false. Next, assertion says A geneticist crossed two pea plants and got 50% tall and 50% dwarf in the progeny. Reason is one plant was heterozygous tall and other was dwarf. So let's backtrack the question. The reason is saying one plant was heterozygous tall, okay, and the other was dwarf. So heterozygous tall means capital T, small t, and dwarf, there is only one option, small t, small t. So if we make a cross, what we are going to get is capital T, small t, capital T, small t, small t, small t, small t, small t. So two of them are going to be tall and two of them are going to be dwarf. So 50% of the progeny will come out to be tall, 50% of the progeny will come out to be dwarf. So not only is both the reason and assertion correct, but reason is the correct explanation, absolutely correct explanation for the assertion, right? So we'll choose option A. Both assertion and reason are correct, and reason is the correct explanation for assertion. Question 3, mutation. Assertion says mutation is a sudden change in the genetic material, which is true. Reason says variation is useful for the survival of species over time. Both these statements are correct, but these are kind of unrelated statements, right? First one is talking about that mutation is a sudden change in the genetic material, and second statement is talking about variation is useful for the survival of species. So even though both the statements are correct, they are kind of unrelated, and reason is not explaining anything about assertion, or it is not giving any explanation about assertion. So we are going to choose option B, that both assertion and reason are correct, but reason is not the correct explanation for assertion. Lastly, assertion says pea plant is considered ideal for hybridization experiments. This statement is true. Pea plant had many qualities that made it an ideal plant to be used in hybridization experiments. Reason says pea is a self-pollinating plant with a short life cycle and bears contrasting characteristics. So these are basically the reasons that are given that why pea plant was considered to be ideal for hybridization experiments, which are true. Pea is a self-pollinating plant. It has a short life cycle, so it produces a large sample size, or it produces many generations over a small period of time, and it has contrasting characteristics, which makes the hybridization experiments, or which makes the study of these characteristics very easy, these contrasting characteristics. So the reason is absolutely correct, and it is actually explaining why pea plant is considered ideal for hybridization experiments. So the answer will be A, option A. Both assertion and reason are correct, and reason is the correct explanation for assertion. Moving on to the next case study based question. So we will read the passage twice, and then we are going to answer the questions that follow. So the passage says, we are an integral part of the environment. Changes in the environment affect us, and our activities change the environment around us. Ozone, O3, is a molecule formed by 3 atoms of oxygen, while O2, which we normally refer to as oxygen, is essential for all aerobic forms of life. Ozone is a deadly poison. However, at higher levels of the atmosphere, ozone performs an essential function. It shields the surface of the earth from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Let's have a read at this passage again. We are an integral part of the environment. Changes in the environment affect us, and our activities change the environment around us. Ozone O3 is a molecule formed by 3 atoms of oxygen, while O2, which we normally refer to as oxygen, is essential for all aerobic forms of life. Ozone is a deadly poison. However, at higher levels of the atmosphere, ozone performs an essential function. It shields the surface of the earth from the ultraviolet radiations of the sun. First question, how is ozone formed? So we know that the UV radiations that come from the sun, they split oxygen into 2 molecules of nascent oxygen, and this nascent oxygen, when it combines with molecular oxygen, it forms ozone, right? So UV radiations that come from the sun split molecular oxygen into nascent oxygen. This nascent oxygen, when it combines with the molecular oxygen, it forms ozone. Okay. Next question, in which layer of the atmosphere is ozone present in? So we know that ozone is present in the stratosphere layer of the atmosphere. Next, what are the causes for ozone depletion? So, use of synthetic chemicals like CFCs, that stand for chlorofluorocarbons, they were basically used in refrigerants as coolants. They were used in refrigerators, and they were also used in fire extinguishers. So these are the main causes that have resulted into the depletion of the ozone layer. Next question, write the chemical reaction for the formation of ozone. So as we already explained it in the first part, oxygen, by the action of the ultraviolet rays that come from the sun, split into 2 molecules of nascent oxygen. These nascent oxygen, they combine with the molecular oxygen to form ozone. So the chemical equation is also given. Next, and the last part of the question is, what are the harmful effects of UV radiations? So UV radiation, they can cause skin diseases, and they can also cause skin diseases like premature aging and skin cancer. Apart from that, they can cause eye diseases such as cataract. They can also cause eye cancer, and in worst case scenario, they can also result into complete blindness. Apart from that, UV radiations can cause mutation in the DNA. They can cause mutation in the DNA, and they can cause damage to the DNA. So they can actually have adverse effect on the organism at the very basic genetic level. So 3 harmful effects of UV radiations. First, they can affect the skin. They can cause various skin diseases like skin cancer and premature aging. They can affect the eye. They can cause diseases such as eye cancer and cataract. And thirdly, they can cause changes or mutation in the DNA, and they can also cause damage to the DNA. So the topics that we have covered in this particular session: Mendel's experiments, sex determination, types of traits, decomposition, ozone, energy flow, food chain, and trophic levels. If we look at the important topics in this chapter, we already discussed a monohybrid cross. You should be well aware of the dihybrid cross as well, right? You should be well aware of all the 3 laws of Mendel's, and the characteristics that Mendel used as contrasting characteristic in P's, which is the dominant recessive characteristic, as well as if we talk about heredity and evolution, you should be, there are no diagrams based questions that you can expect. Basically, there can be flowchart based questions. You can be required to draw the flowchart of a monohybrid cross or a dihybrid cross, or you can be required to draw the flowchart of sex determination. So that can be asked in a 5-marker question along with some other question. If we talk about our environment, then ozone is a very important topic. It can be asked in a 5-marker question. Uh, Different types of food chains and trophic levels and the energy flow that takes place, the 10% law of energy. Apart from that, the entire types of waste management. Why is it important to manage waste? What are the different types of waste, biodegradable, non-biodegradable, that we have already covered also in today's session. So these all things you should be well prepared with. And again, I'll repeat some of the tips that you should follow while answering a question. Try to write your answers point wise, right? It will make the answer better to look at. Instead of writing long paragraphs, you can break down your answer into points and write it point wise. You can underline some words of your answers that you want to highlight or that you think are necessary. It would lead a good impact, it would lead a good impression if you sort of underline or highlight the important points. It will also make the answer more visible, right? More clearer to the examiner. Apart from that, draw and label the diagrams neatly. Use a pencil to draw all the diagrams, and your labelings should be neat. Try to label in capital letters if you can, right? That would lead a good or a better impact. Apart from that, read the question carefully, especially the MCQ questions. Read the questions thoroughly, read the options thoroughly, right? And do not skip the important points that are mentioned in the question. What is the question asking? Is it asking to identify the correct statement? Is it asking to identify the incorrect statement? So read the question very, very carefully. Read the assertion and reason questions very carefully and analyze which of the 4 options should be correct. Okay. And try to manage your time in such a way that you know how much to write for a particular question. You know that if this is a 2-marker question, then you don't need to fill pages, because then you would be wasting your time. So you should understand that if it is a 2-marker question, you can end your answer गिविंग ऑल दी नेसेसरी पॉइंट्स. ऐसा नहीं है कि कुछ पॉइंट छोड़ना है बीच में या कुछ पॉइंट्स नहीं लिख के आने हैं, सब मेंशन करो, बट ट्राई टू कीप इट एज सिंपल एंड एज क्रिस्प एज पॉसिबल. जितने कम वर्ड्स में सारे के सारे पॉइंट्स मेंशन कर सकते हो फॉर अ 2-marker और फॉर अ 1-marker, दैट यू शुड डू. Then थोड़ा सा detailed in 3-marker, and lastly 5-marker में you can write lengthy answers depending on what type of question is presented to you. अगर 5-mark question के 5 parts है तो हर part का lengthy answer लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है. Then हर part को आप 1-marker की तरह treat कर सकते हो, and जैसे आप एक 1-marker के लिए answer करोगे वैसे ही करना. लेकिन अगर एक question 5-marker में बस एक ही question आ रहा है, बस एक ही question पूछा हुआ है, then obviously you have to write down a long and lengthy answer. And always remember, if you have time in your hands, अगर कहीं डायग्राम बनाने के लिए नहीं भी बोला है और उस पर्टिकुलर क्वेश्चन का आपको लग सकता है कि आप डायग्राम बना सकते हो, तो यू शुड मेक द डायग्राम इफ यू हैव टाइम इन योर हैंड्स. ऐसे नहीं है कि हर क्वेश्चन का आप डायग्राम बनाने लग जाओ, नहीं. इफ इट्स आस्क्ड इन अ क्वेश्चन दैट डायग्रामेटिकली एक्सप्लेन और यूजिंग अ डायग्राम एक्सप्लेन, then obviously anyway you have to draw a diagram. But if it is not specified, if it is not mentioned, then you don't need to draw the diagram. End may, if you think that yes, time is left, then maybe you can draw a diagram. It will lead, or it would add on to your answer. It will explain your answer in a better way, right? So that is all for today's session. Thank you so much everyone, and all the best.